Ruhar is assistant managing editor for Time. Bob Herbert is senior fellow at Demos. And Stephen Moore is an editorial writer for the Wall Street Journal. Bob, the economy is adding jobs. We can see that from those charts. The unemployment rate is falling. No question about that. But is this a statistical jobs recovery or evidence that life is actually improving for anybody, really?
Well, there is really a recovery in jobs. We're getting a couple 100,000 jobs, a little more a month. But two quick points. One, we were in such a deep hole that is not really enough to help us climb out of the hole. And two, the quality of the jobs. The quality of the jobs are not great. A lot of the jobs that are being created are part-time or low wage or whatever, you know. So those are two of the reasons why people don't feel they're in a recovery.
Ronna, let's talk more about feelings, because in September, just 10% of Americans described economic conditions as good. This is according to a CNN RRC poll. That number has risen steadily. Today, you've got 3 in 10 Americans who say things are going well. It's a consumer-driven economy, so can the economy recover without the consumer feeling better about things?
Absolutely not. And the consumer doesn't feel better because, as you've already shown with your graphs, it's a 2-speed recovery. Stocks are up, but those benefit mostly the wealthy. The majority of Americans still keep their money in housing. The housing market is not back. Meanwhile, wages have been flat throughout not only this recovery, which has taken longer than any other in history, but really since the 70s. I mean, the person hasn't gotten a raise in America since 1968.
Wow. Okay, this week I spoke with the CEO of FedEx, the founder and CEO of FedEx, Fred Smith. We were in Washington. Naturally, I wanted to know what message he wanted to send our political leaders on behalf of business.
Well, the country simply does not have an adequate growth rate to provide an increased standard of living, which the
economy is not doing well enough.
It's not doing well enough. Our growth rate has gone down from almost 4% to about 2% over the past 30 years, and that's not enough to both improve people's standards of living, provide full employment.
And Stephen, Fred went on to tell me that the current policies are standing in the way of robust growth, which sounds a little bit like someone I know named Stephen Moore. So let's get specific. If we want to see the standard of living improve for the majority of Americans, what needs to change first?
Well, Christine, I'm not joking when I say that if I could handpick anybody to be president of the United States, it would probably be Fred Smith.
Really?
This is a guy who knows how to run an operation and run it efficiently, and Fred has run FedEx amazingly well. Look, I do think the economy is recovering. I think it's doing pretty well right now. The question is how robust and how sustainable this recovery is. I think that if I were advising President Obama, I would give him one piece of advice. Do not raise taxes in 2013. I think that the economy is way too fragile right now. The recovery is just too early a stage.
Are you making the assumption that he's the president in 2013?
Well, I'm saying...
I mean, are you making an endorsement or a prognosis
if he
here?
is, look, I just think it's a big mistake to be... the economy is doing well. I worry that starting in September, October, as people say, wait a minute, we're going to face this big tax tsunami starting in January. Capital gains going up, dividends going up, small business tax going up. I'm not sure the economy can withstand that. And second of all, I do think we should have a much more aggressive energy policy that exploits our own natural resources.
If I can just talk about the tax, though, I think if you look historically, in the periods in this country where we had the greatest growth, 50s and 60s, we also had much higher tax rates. I just think that argument doesn't wash. And in terms of a CEO president, I mean, I would make the point that actually running a company and running a country are two different things. And in fact, there's a huge bifurcation between the fortunes of companies and the fortunes of most rich nations right now. And that's the divide we're talking about.
It's so interesting you go back to the 50s and 60s. The last time anybody got a raise, you know, the American worker got a raise was 1968. I want to ask you, this is also at the same time concurrent with huge, rapid technological innovations that have fostered globalization. And we see the world changing. I say this every week, right? We see the world changing, Bob, faster than American families can keep up. And Washington seems absolutely unable to get out of its 4-year thought cycle to address what is a really changing reinvention of this country.
We have become a can't-do society. When I was growing up in those early post-war decades, we were a can-do society, and one of the main things we did then was invest in the future of the United States and in the American people. The reason I think taxes have to go up are twofold. One, we have these enormous budget deficits. We have to begin to get some handle on them at some point. But even more important, we have to make some investments in our infrastructure, in education, in other areas, research and development, and that's where you'll get the new ideas, the innovation, the new industries that will power the American future.
You know, interestingly enough, April 1st the United States becomes the highest corporate income tax rate country in the world.
Look, that's a bogus issue,
no, it's
because
important.
The corporations are not paying that tax.
Look, you ask anyone who's running a major corporation, and even President Obama's own economists say this is putting America at a competitive disadvantage.
Why do they have so many trillions? Why are they sitting on these trillions of dollars in these corporations?
Because they're very reluctant to invest. But I just want to make one point. This idea they're very risk averse right now because of policy. But I have to say this in terms of a positive note. This that the American middle class has not made advances since the late 1960s is crazy. The average middle class family, when you take into account all the things that we have today, 40 to 50% better off than they were in the 1960s. So this idea we haven't made economic progress, I just think it's really very misleading.
So we have record rates of poverty, but at least we have cell phones?
We have, I mean, access to much better health care. We have access to goods and services. Would anybody actually today want to go back to the way people lived in the 1950s?
No one said there haven't been improvements in the society in the past half decade. I would never argue that point. But middle class families have really struggled, and one of the ways they've kept themselves above, or among the ways they've kept themselves above water, is women have gone into the workforce, wives and mothers.
That's true.
People are working. Wait, just a minute. People are working longer hours.
This is a pet peeve of mine.
And they took on tremendous amounts of debt.
The idea that women weren't working in the 1950s and 60s
not to the same degree.
They were working.
You could have a middle class standard of living in the 1950s and 60s on a single income if you had a middle class job.
Women
were working back then. Not to the same degree.
This is not a gender issue.
I'm talking about paid work. I'm talking about paid work. I'm not saying that, and I also think it's a good idea that women went into workforce. So I'm not being critical of that, but I'm saying they had to do that to keep the families above water economically.
We've tried to basically cover up this downturn in incomes for the last 40 years with two incomes, with another thing. But let's put a couple of facts on the table here. The labor percent of GDP in this society is at all-time lows. And going back to your point about technological job destruction, that link was broken in the 70s. That's when education stopped keeping up with technology. So Bob's right that infrastructure and investment and education, these are the things that are going to get us out of this mess.
We have more time to talk about all this. You're all staying, so don't move. All right, up next, gas prices are on the rise. So are our hopes that somebody in Washington can stop them. Unrealistic. Plus, building on bricks. That's bricks without a K. We're talking Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Newly emerging economies all meeting in India this week. And